Good Tuesday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for January the 10th. Today we are reading together in Genesis chapter 13 and also Genesis chapter 14. Hope that you've had a great start to your week so far. Let me go ahead and get our text of Genesis 13 up on the screen for us. We will get to reading together. We are looking at the continued story of Abram, who is going to come to be known as Abraham, the father of our faith, as he's described in Romans chapter 4. We're seeing just the progression of the story of Abraham. Remember, he is first chosen in chapter 12. He is given three magnificent promises from God in his covenant that he made with God, or that God made with him, that he would be able to come into possession of a great land. His descendants would live in this great land, and that through this land and through the descendants of that are within it, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Remember, that's coming off the heels of the dividing of the nations in chapter 11, which seems to be the culmination of everything that happened up until chapter 11. God separates himself from the nations, chooses Abraham for himself as his own special man and special people. And then begins the story of God drawing the nations back to himself through this family of Abraham. Again, all the nations of the earth will be blessed by the descendants of Abraham, specifically one descendant who is to come. Abraham goes down to Egypt for a short time because of a famine that took place within Canaan. Not a good decision on his part, and kind of turned out not very good for him as far as the experience goes. Now he is back up in Canaan, and yet we're going to see that there are some more problems that present themselves, not necessarily anything that Abraham does wrong, just some logistical issues between himself and the family of his nephew Lot and all of his possessions. They're going to have to work out how they're going to divide themselves up in order to just split up, because there's not enough land for them to both be supported here. And then we're going to see where Abraham comes to the rescue of Lot after Lot makes some not very wise decisions. We're going to see that here in chapters 13 and 14. So let's go ahead and read here Genesis 13, beginning in verse number 1, reading through the end of Genesis 14, a couple of chapters today. Genesis 13, verse number 1, Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, he, his wife, and all he had, and Lot with him. Abram was very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. He went by stages from the Negev to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had formerly been, to the site where he had built the altar. And Abram called on the name of Yahweh there. Now Lot, who was traveling with Abram, also had flocks, herds, and tents. But the land was unable to support them as long as they stayed together, for they had so many possessions that they could not stay together. And there was quarreling between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were living in the land. So Abram said to Lot, "Please, let's not have quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, since we are relatives. Isn't the whole land before you? Separate from me. If you go to the left, I will go to the right. If you go to the right, I will go to the left." Lot looked out and saw the entire plain of the Jordan as far as Zoar, as well. It was well watered everywhere, like the Lord's garden in the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose the entire plain of the Jordan for himself. Then Lot journeyed eastward, and they separated from each other. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, but Lot lived in the cities on the plain and set up his tent near Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were evil, sinning immensely against the Lord. After Lot had separated from him, Yahweh said to Abram, "Look from the place where you are. Look north and south, east and west, for I will give you and your offspring forever all the land that you see. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust of the earth, then your offspring could be counted. Get up and walk around the land through its length and width, for I will give it to you." So Abram moved his tent and went to live near the oaks of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. Genesis chapter 14, verse number 1. In those days, King Amraphel of Shinar, King Arioch of Elasar, King Chedorlaomer of Elam, and King Tidal of Goim waged war against King Bera of Sodom, King Bersha of Gomorrah, King Shinab of Admah, and King Shemimber of Zeboim, as well as the king of Bela, that is Zor. All of these came as allies to the Siddim Valley, that is the Dead Sea. They were subject to Chedorlaomer for 12 years, but in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, and Enim in Shava Kirithaim, and the Horites in the mountains of Seir as far as El Paran by the wilderness. Then they came back to invade in Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and they defeated the whole territory of the Amalekites, as well as the Amorites who lived in Hazazon Tamar. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zor, went out and lined up for battle in the Siddim Valley against King Chedorlaomer of Elam, King Tidal of Goim, King Amraphel of Shinar, and King Arioch of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Now, the Siddim Valley contained many asphalt pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled some into them, but the rest fled to the mountains. The 4 kings took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food and went on. They also took Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions, for he was living in Sodom, and they went on. One of the survivors came and told Abram the Hebrew, who lived near the oaks belonging to Mamre, the Amorites, the brother of Eshcol, and the brother of Ener. They were bound by a treaty with Abraham. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken prisoner, he assembled his 318 trained men born in his household, and they went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he and his servants deployed against them by night, defeated them, and pursued them as far as Hobah to the north of Damascus. He brought back all the goods, and also his relative Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the other people. After Abram returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the Shaveh Valley, that is the King's Valley. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out the bread and wine. He was a priest to the Most High God, or to God Most High. He blessed him and said, Abram is blessed by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has handed over the enemies to you, or has handed over your enemies to you. And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. The king of Sodom said to Abram, give me the people, but take the possessions for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I raise my hand in an oath to Yahweh, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or sandal strap or anything that belongs to you. So you can never say, I made Abram rich. I will take nothing except what the servants have eaten. But as for the share of the men who came with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, they can take their share. And that concludes Genesis chapters 13 and 14. There's a good bit going on here. Some of the highlights we'll look at real quick just to consider what we find here within the text. To begin with, Abram is making his way back from Egypt to the Negev, back to the land of Canaan. And the text tells us that he is very rich. He gained some possessions while being in Egypt, but he is just accumulating possessions. God, having blessed him, is showing that blessing in a very tangible way in the fact that he is very rich at this time. But more importantly is the fact that his return to the promised land, his physical return to Canaan, the land that God was going to give him, seems to also stimulate a spiritual return. Remember, he had gone down, deceived, not been very faithful in Egypt. Now he's coming back to Canaan, and it seems as if his faith is returning as well. He gets back to that place between Bethel and Ai, this place where he built an altar, and there he calls on the name of the Lord. I believe we can read into that he offers sacrifices and worships Yahweh here in this place. But one of the issues that continues to be here is the fact that the land cannot support both his many flocks and his great possessions, and also that of his nephew Lot. And Abram here shows the gracious nature of his character. As the superior of the two, he very well could have just taken what he wanted and told Lot that you can have the leftovers. But instead, what we have here is Abram offering to Lot whatever he would choose to have. A great quote from Walke in his writing on this text. He says, "The social superior humbles himself before the inferior to preserve peace, thereby proving himself the spiritual superior. Abram's faith gives him the freedom to be generous." He believes he can be generous to Lot because he knows Yahweh has been so generous to him, and whatever he needs, he knows that Yahweh is faithful to provide that. Unfortunately for Lot, he follows in the footsteps of his mother, and I use that in the not the literal sense, but his mother Eve. Just as Eve looked and saw things were good and took, so Lot does the same here. He looks out, sees the entire plain of the Jordan. He sees that it's well watered. It's just like everything in the Lord's garden and in Egypt. And he goes and he takes that. And this is foreshadowing, I believe, that this decision-making on his part is not going to end very well for him. More bad foreshadowing is the fact that he goes east. And going east up until this point in the Bible story, you might have caught on, is never a good thing. Whenever Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, they go east. Whenever Cain is told to be an endless wanderer, he goes east. Every time people go east, bad things happen. And that certainly is going to be the case here. Another thing we need to point out is that Abram remains in Canaan, but the way that it is described here, that Lot lived in the cities on the plain, near Sodom, it seems that if Lot is now living outside of the promised land, that he is no longer remaining in Canaan, the land that Yahweh had given to his uncle Abram, but now he is living outside of that, and living outside of that, he very much is going to be open to various difficulties that come from not being in the promised land, not being the place that he is supposed to be, we might say. Abram interacts with Yahweh here another time in verse 14. And he reaffirms the promises of the land and the nation. He says, look to the north, south, east, and west. Everything you see, I'm going to give to you. And I'm going to make your offspring so great that they're going to be like the dust of the earth, that if anybody was able to count the dust particles, then they could count your descendants. Just making very strong statements here of just how great the promises that he is going to experience, him and his descendants, just how great they're going to be. And then finally, the text concludes in chapter 13 with Abram again going near the oaks of Mamre in Hebron, and he builds an altar. He builds an altar to the Lord there. Once we move into chapter 14, we see that there is trouble within the land. These kings are at war. Certain kings were subject. They would have been paying tribute to these other kings, but then they rebel. And whenever they rebel, this great fight ends up taking place. This battle takes place in the Siddim Valley, and there's a defeat. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, they make a run for it. They're defeated, and as they're defeated, they also end up taking possession. The victorious kings end up taking possession of Abram's nephew Lot. And we might be wondering, well, why is that the case? Why was Lot with them? Well, it's because not only had Lot up to this point set up his tent near Sodom, he had not only gone so far east to be near Sodom, but at this point the text tells us that he actually had established himself in Sodom. So he goes from being near Sodom to being in Sodom, and because of that, he gets caught up in this strife, in this war. Again, let's think about what we've seen so far. Whenever people go outside the promised land, bad things happen. They went outside the promised land, and what happened? Whenever Abraham and Sarai did that, whenever Abram and Sarai did that, I'm going to try to keep the name straight at this time. Whenever they did that, bad things happened. They had that negative interaction with Pharaoh. Now that Lot has gone outside the promised land, what happens? He ends up getting captured in this dispute. So there's somebody who escapes and runs to Abram the Hebrew. He is obviously well known enough for him to think that this is the person that he needs to go talk to, so that he can have Lot rescued. Abram gets his 318 men, which sounds like a lot, but against 5 kings, probably not so. It's probably not a lot. But here's the thing. It wasn't just that he had 318 trained men, but he had Yahweh behind him. He had Yahweh behind him. So with Yahweh's help, he was able to go by night, and he was able to defeat these kings and bring back his nephew and bring back all the spoils of war and those who had been captured. So whenever he does that, we get to verse 17 of chapter 15, or excuse me, chapter 14. And the king of Sodom goes to meet Abram so that he can get back what he believes he ought to receive from Abram after the victory that Abram has had. But there's somebody else who enters the picture now. His name is Melchizedek. He is the king of Salem. Salem. If you just think about that word Salem, S-A-L-E-M, it's probably familiar to you because we know this place of Salem as being Jerusalem or Jerusalem. So this king of what is going to be known as Jerusalem, he's not only king of Jerusalem, he's also described as being a priest to God Most High, to El Elyon, which is also a name for Yahweh that is given in Psalm 78 and verse 35. And here in Genesis 14 and verses 19 and 20, here the priest of Salem blesses Abram 3 times, again, repeating the 3 blessings, or at least the number of blessings that Abram has received back in chapter 12. Abram is blessed by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and back up to verse 19. It says that he blessed him, that this priest of El Elyon blessed Abram and said, Abram is blessed by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be the God Most High who has handed over your enemies to you. Again, there is recognition from all those that it was Yahweh who caused this victory to take place. It did not happen because Abram had the superior forces. Don't believe he did. He would not have had superior forces against 5 kings, but instead God gives him the victory. So after Melchizedek, who again plays a part in Hebrews, the New Testament text of Hebrews, because he is compared to Jesus to show that someone did not have to come from the tribe of Levi in order to be a priest to God. He's a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, is what the Hebrew writer says concerning Jesus. After he blesses Abram, the king of Sodom then steps forward, and he doesn't give much courtesy. He doesn't give many thanks. He just says, hey, give me the people and you can take the possessions. That's what I'll give you. Just matter of fact, no thanks, no courtesy. Just give me the people, you take the possessions. But Abram says to the king of Sodom, he says, I raise my hand in an oath to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will not take anything from you. I don't want you to be able to hold that over my head. I don't want you to be able to claim that you made Abram rich, because I'm not that's not anything I want. I want no association with you. I don't want anybody to think that we have anything to do with one another. Seems to be that Abram, again, already knew about the wickedness of Sodom. He didn't want anything to do with Sodom. If only his nephew Lot had that same sort of mindset and attitude. So he gives back what he gets. He only gives whatever those who he is in agreement with, whether it's a Ner, Eshcol, or Mamre. He lets them take what they need, and the text ends at that point here in verse 21 or 24 of chapter 14. So there's a few things to think about here. Number one, just something to recognize. Remember that this is not being written as it is taking place. So this is more than likely Moses writing later on, compiling all these things that has taken place. So what you're going to see, if you're a careful reader and you notice a few things, there are some descriptions here that are anachronisms. Anachronisms. I think it's saying that the right way. Or anachronisms. There we go. Meaning that they are described in a way that has not happened yet. So, for instance, earlier we saw in verse 14 that they went in pursuit as far as Dan. Well, Dan's not a thing yet, because Dan hasn't been established. The tribe of Dan is not a thing. So we recognize that it's not describing how it would have been described in the moment, but it's being described in a way that would help the original reader to understand that. The same thing with the Amalekites and some other things that are found within this chapter. So don't be tripped up by that. Some would like to use that to say that these things are not really happening, as just a made-up story, or that mistakes were made. No, they're written in such a way to help describe to someone at this time who is reading it what exactly was taking place. It'd be like for us, we're reading about the Civil War, or we'll just say the Revolutionary War, and we'll say, you know, this battle took place up in Boston, Massachusetts. And I probably didn't say that state right, because I don't know why I picked this, because Katie always makes fun of me because I cannot say that state's name right. But anyways, it happened in Boston. Was Boston even a thing yet? I don't know. I mean, I guess it could have been. But what we probably know as Boston, what we're thinking of, wasn't actually there during the Revolutionary War, but we are thinking about that because it helps us to place it in the right location. Same thing going on here. So don't get tripped up. Don't be wondering, well, how are they saying that Dan's already here whenever Dan's not a thing yet? Just remember that we're reading history. Therefore, it could be used in various ways to describe to the original readers to help them understand. But number two, and lastly, what I want to think about for today, remember these texts help us to do a number of things. They help us to understand why the world is the way it is today, help us understand why nations rise and fall, what God is doing with sin, and how these texts help us to see ourselves. Whenever it comes to Lot, you know, you just see the progression of getting closer and closer to bad decisions. That one bad decision can lead to another bad decision and can lead to another until you find yourself in a lot of trouble. Again, we see that with just the language that's used here. He looked, he saw, he liked what he saw, he took. That leads him close to Sodom. And then he's in Sodom. And then later on in a few chapters, he's going to be a well-known person within Sodom. We have to be able to recognize whenever a bad decision gets us in a bad place and just make better decisions. Get away from that place. Don't continue to allow one bad decision to snowball into a worse decision. That is something that we could certainly learn from Lot, and we're going to continue to see that as we go throughout this story, the story of Lot with Abram, and everything Abram's going to do for Lot as the story progresses. So make good decisions. If we make one bad decision, recognize that, fix it. Don't allow bad decisions to compound. Don't continue to go closer and closer to that which is only going to lead to heartache, force, and difficulty. Make good decisions so that we can remain in a wonderful relationship with God, where we can experience the blessings that he longs to give us as Abraham's heirs, Abraham's descendants, those according to faith. Thanks so much for tuning into this reading on this Tuesday. Hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday. Tomorrow, actually, we'll be reading from Genesis chapter 15 and 16, where the Abrahamic covenant is going to be reestablished. We're also going to see in chapter 16 the issue with Hagar and Ishmael, where Abram, he's a man of faith, yes, but he does make some mistakes. One of those, he kind of takes things into his hands a little too often. We're going to see one of those mistakes in chapter 16 in our read tomorrow. Again, thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions or comments about the text or anything you'd like to point out, please feel free to leave that in the comment section on Facebook or YouTube, and I'd love to have a discussion there with you about those things. Again, thanks for tuning in. Have a great day, everyone. Take care, and God bless.